right, so today we're going to be doing a deep dive on the Hostel franchise. And I know you're already familiar with the movies, so we're going to go kind of beyond that torture porn label that gets slapped on them
Yeah.
and really dig into some of the themes and the impact and even think about why this series might still be relevant today.
Yeah. I think what's fascinating about the Hostel films is that they really tap into something very primal, a fear of the unknown, which I think is something that most people can relate to, especially in the context of travel.
Yeah, I totally get that. The first Hostel back in 2005 um, starts with, this group of backpackers really kind of living the dream in Europe.
Yeah.
But it quickly turns into this nightmare scenario when they end up in Slovakia.
Yeah.
It's this bait and switch that plays on that sense of vulnerability that you can get when you're in a foreign place.
Exactly. And I think that's part of what made it resonate so strongly with audiences when it came out and was such a box office hit,
Oh.
tapping into a very real fear. But there's also this kind of clever subversion of expectations at play. We're so used to seeing Europe portrayed as this very safe and sophisticated destination. But Hostel kind of turns that on its head and exposes this dark underbelly that's both alluring and terrifying at the same time.
And it's not just the setting, right? It's the whole concept of
Yeah.
this elite hunting organization that's so unsettling.
Yeah.
This idea that someone could be lured into this horrific situation and treated like a commodity. I mean, that's a whole other level of disturbing.
Right. It's almost like the film is holding up a mirror to certain aspects of society and forcing us to confront, the dark potential of human nature and the power dynamics that are at play, the way that violence is commodified. I mean, these are all themes that really have an impact.
And that's what makes Hostel more than just a gory horror flick. It's forcing us to ask some pretty uncomfortable questions. For example, does knowing that there's a real-world basis for some of these themes, like human trafficking and the dark web and things like that, does that make the films more frightening for you? Or is it easier to just dismiss it as pure fiction?
That's a really intriguing question, I find. The films certainly blur the lines between fantasy and reality, which adds to their unsettling nature.
Now let's shift gears a bit and talk about Hostel, Part 2, which came out in 2007. We have a new set of victims, this time women in Italy. But I think what really struck me about this one was that we actually get to see the clients of elite hunting.
Yeah, that's a crucial element in part two. We're no longer just witnessing the violence from the victim's perspective. We're actually forced to confront the people who are paying for this, who are driving the demand.
Yeah, it's like the film is implicating the viewer in a way,
Wow.
forcing us to ask ourselves, could this happen anywhere? Could this even happen here?
Exactly. And by showing us the faces of the clients, their motivations, their casual cruelty, it raises some really disturbing questions about the nature of evil. It's not just a few twisted individuals. It suggests a system, a network of complicity that enables this kind of horror.
And I think that's part of the reason why Hostel Part 2 got a bit of a more mixed reception than the first. Some people loved that it dug deeper into the psychology of the villains, but others felt like it lacked that raw shock value of the original.
Yeah, that's a valid point. I think part two is definitely a more introspective film, less focused on the visceral thrills and more concerned with exploring the ethical and psychological implications of the premise. It's challenging the audience in a different way, asking us to confront not just the horror of the violence itself, but also the systems and structures that allow it to flourish.
Speaking of challenging expectations,
Hmm.
we then got Hostel, Part 3, which ditched Europe entirely and landed smack dab in Las Vegas.
It was a bold choice for sure, shifting the setting to America.
Yeah.
And, initially it might seem like a departure from the themes established in the first two films, but on closer examination, I think it's actually a brilliant move.
Yeah, I'm starting to see that now Vegas is all about excess risk-taking, pushing boundaries. It's
Yeah.
a place where people go to escape reality, to indulge their darkest desires. And that really ties in perfectly with the themes of the Hostel franchise.
Right. And by setting the film in Vegas, Roth is making a statement about the universality of these dark impulses.
Yeah.
It's not just a foreign problem. It exists everywhere, even in the heart of the American dream.
It's like he's saying, look, the things that scared you in the first two films, the darkness that you think is confined to some far-off corner of the world, it's right here. It's in your backyard.
Exactly. And the fact that Hostel Part 3 went straight to DVD might actually say more about the changing landscape of the film industry at the time than about the quality of the film itself, because thematically, it's a natural progression of the ideas explored in the first two films.
Yeah.
It's pushing the boundaries even further and forcing us to confront the darkness that lurks within our own society.
All right, so let's tackle the elephant in the room here. That torture porn label that's been attached to the Hostel franchise. Do you think it's a fair label?
That's a complex question, and there's no easy answer. The torture porn debate is still ongoing, with valid arguments on both sides. Some critics argue that the term is too reductive, that it ignores the social commentary and thematic depth that's present in films like Hostel. Others argue that the label is accurate, that these films exploit our fascination with violence and suffering for pure entertainment value.
It's a tough one, for sure. I mean, on the one hand, the Hostel films are undeniably graphic and disturbing. But on the other hand, they do seem to be trying to say something about the world, about human nature, about the dangers of unchecked power and greed.
And that's what makes the debate so interesting. It forces us to confront our own limits when it comes to horror, to ask ourselves what we're willing to watch and why.
And whether or not you agree with that torture porn label, I think it's important to acknowledge that Hostel sparked a lot of controversy and discussion, which in itself is a testament to its impact.
Absolutely. It pushed the boundaries of what was considered acceptable in mainstream horror, and it forced us to confront our own anxieties about violence, vulnerability, and the dark underbelly of human nature.
And even if you haven't seen the Hostel films, I bet you felt their influence. Their DNA can be found in a whole wave of horror films that followed, exploring similar themes of graphic violence, social commentary, and that unsettling blend of realism and exploitation.
That's a great point. The Hostel franchise didn't invent torture porn, but it certainly popularized it. And its influence continues to ripple through the genre today. So, picking up where we left off, I think it's interesting to consider the visual style of the Hostel films and how Eli Roth uses cinematography and editing to kind of heighten that sense of dread and unease.
Now that you mention it, the camera work in those movies did always feel really deliberate.
Yeah.
Like it was trying to make you uncomfortable on purpose.
Yeah, exactly. Roth often uses these very long takes and static shots, particularly in the scenes leading up to the violence, which creates this incredible sense of anticipation and inevitability. It's almost like you're trapped in the moment with the characters, unable to escape what's coming.
Oh, yeah. I totally remember that feeling from the first Hostel. That scene where they first arrive at the hostel in Slovakia, and the camera just lingers on all these creepy details, like the peeling paint and the strange stains on the walls. Sets this unsettling tone right from the beginning.
And then you have the use of shaky cam during the violence itself, which, adds to the chaos and brutality of the scenes. It's a technique that's often criticized for being gratuitous, but I think in the context of these films, it serves a very specific purpose.
Yeah, I think I see what you mean.
Yeah.
It's like it's trying to put you right there in the middle of the action,
Yeah.
make you feel the visceral impact of the violence without holding anything back.
Precisely. And by refusing to shy away from the gore, Roth is forcing us to confront the reality of what's happening. He's not letting us off the hook with quick cuts or stylized violence. It's raw, it's brutal, and it's definitely meant to provoke a reaction.
And it works. I mean, I remember watching those movies for the first time, and there were moments where I literally had to look away. It was just too intense.
It's also interesting how Roth uses humor to counterbalance the horror in these films, because while they're undeniably dark and disturbing, there are these moments of black comedy that kind of provide a brief respite from the tension.
Oh, that's so true. I think that's one of the reasons why I can actually go back and rewatch these movies, despite how messed up they are. There's this kind of morbid humor that keeps them from becoming too oppressive.
It's a delicate balancing act for sure, and Roth really pulls it off masterfully. The humor never feels gratuitous or out of place. It's always rooted in the characters and the situations, and it serves to remind us that even in the darkest of times, there's still room for absurdity and even laughter.
Speaking of character, it's interesting that the victims in Hostel aren't always the most likable or sympathetic bunch, which is kind of unusual for a horror movie.
Yeah, that's another aspect of Roth's filmmaking that I find fascinating. He's not afraid to make his characters flawed, even unlikable at times. They're not always making the smartest decisions, and they can be selfish, arrogant, and even cruel.
And I think that makes their predicament even more unsettling, because on some level we can relate to their flaws, their vulnerabilities, and that makes us question how we might react in a similar situation.
Exactly. It adds a layer of psychological realism to the films, reminding us that even seemingly good people are capable of making terrible choices, especially when faced with extreme circumstances.
Now, going back to this idea of the Hostel films tapping into anxieties about globalization, I think it's worth noting that the victims in these films are almost always young American tourists.
Right, that's not a coincidence. Reneth is very deliberately playing on our fears of the ugly American stereotype. The naive traveler who ventures into the wider world unprepared for the dangers that await.
And it's not just about physical danger either, right? It's about the clash of cultures, the fear of the unknown, the sense that the world is a much more complicated and dangerous place than we might like to believe.
Absolutely. The Hostel films tap into this deep-seated anxiety about the loss of innocence. The realization that the world isn't always a safe and welcoming place, especially for those who come from a position of privilege and power.
And that anxiety is amplified by the way the films portray Europe. It's not the romanticized postcard version of Europe that we often see in movies. It's this darker, grittier, more dangerous place where the rules are different and the consequences can be deadly.
And that contrast between expectation and reality is a big part of what makes these films so effective. They shatter our illusions about the world, forcing us to confront the possibility that even in the most familiar of settings, there can be hidden dangers lurking beneath the surface.
It's like a reminder that no matter how much we try to control our environment to create this bubble of safety and security, there will always be forces beyond our control that can threaten to disrupt our carefully constructed world.
Precisely. And that's a fear that I think resonates particularly strongly in our current age of globalization and interconnectedness. As the world shrinks and cultures collide, there's this sense that the familiar is becoming increasingly unfamiliar, that the boundaries between us and them are blurring, and that can be both exciting and terrifying.
And that's where the Hostel films come in, right? They offer this kind of cathartic exploration of those anxieties, a way to confront our fears in a safe and controlled environment.
Right. Because even though these films depict horrific violence and cruelty, they also offer a sense of closure, a resolution, that reassures us that even in the face of unimaginable evil, there's still hope for survival, for justice, for a restoration of order.
And speaking of justice, there's a definite element of revenge fantasy in these films, particularly in the way the protagonists ultimately turn the tables on their tormentors.
Yeah, that's a common theme in horror, and it's certainly present in the Hostel films. This idea that the victims can fight back, that they can reclaim their power, that they can inflict pain on those who have wronged them. It's a very satisfying narrative, even if it's a bit unsettling.
It's like this primal urge, a need to see the scales balanced even if it requires resorting to violence. And I think that's part of what makes the Hostel films so compelling. They tap into our darkest impulses, our desire for revenge, our fascination with violence. And yet they also offer a moral framework, a sense that even in the most extreme situations, there are lines that shouldn't be crossed.
It's a complex and fascinating dynamic, for sure. And it's one of the reasons why these films continue to generate debate and discussion. They force us to confront our own values, our own beliefs about justice and retribution, and they challenge us to consider the consequences of our actions.
Thinking about the Hostel films and that revenge fantasy element makes me wonder if there's a connection to the popularity of horror in general. Is there something about the genre that allows us to tap into those darker impulses in a safe way?
That's an interesting thought. I think horror definitely provides a space for us to explore those taboo desires and emotions that we don't normally, bring out into the open. It's like a pressure valve in a way. It allows us to release those pent-up anxieties and fears, but in a controlled environment.
And with a movie like Hostel, where the violence is so over the top, and the victims are often portrayed as, not the most sympathetic people,
Yeah.
it almost feels like the film is giving us permission to indulge in those darker fantasies without, feeling guilty about it.
Yeah, I see what you mean. There's definitely a sense of detachment, of remove that comes from watching these horrific events unfold on screen. We know it's not real, but still, on some level, it triggers this very primal response, this fascination with violence and suffering that I think is deeply ingrained in our psyches.
It's almost like we're able to experience those forbidden emotions vicariously through the characters,
Yeah.
to explore those dark corners of our minds without actually having to act on them.
Exactly. And I think that's a big part of why horror has been such an enduring genre throughout history. It taps into something very fundamental about the human experience, our fascination with the unknown, our fear of the dark, our capacity for both cruelty and compassion.
It's like this funhouse mirror,
Yeah.
reflecting back our own anxieties and desires, distorted and amplified,
Huh.
but still recognizable as our own.
Precisely. And I think that's why the Hostel films, despite their graphic violence and disturbing themes, continue to have this power to resonate with audiences. They're
Mhm.
offering us this glimpse into the abyss, a confrontation with the darkness that lurks within us all.
And they do it in a way that's both entertaining and thought-provoking.
Right.
Forces us to confront uncomfortable truths about ourselves and the world that we live in.
Absolutely. And while some might dismiss them as just torture porn, I really do think that the Hostel films offer a much richer and more complex viewing experience than that label suggests.
Totally. They're not just about shock value. They're about exploring the dark side of human nature,
Hmm.
the dangers of unchecked power and, the anxieties of a globalized world.
Right. And they do it in a way that's both visceral and intelligent, engaging our emotions while also challenging our intellects.
I think it's safe to say that the Hostel franchise has left a pretty indelible mark on the horror genre,
Mhm.
pushing boundaries and sparking debate along the way.
For sure. And even though it's been years since the last Hostel film, their influence is still felt in so many horror movies that have come out since. Exploring those same themes of graphic violence, social commentary, and that unsettling blend of realism and exploitation.
And who knows? Maybe Eli Roth will decide to revisit the franchise someday. He's certainly not afraid to push buttons and provoke a reaction.
Oh, if he does, I'm sure it'll be just as controversial and thought-provoking as his previous work. He's a filmmaker who really isn't afraid to challenge his audience and explore that dark underbelly of human nature.
And on that note, I think we've reached the end of our deep dive into the Hostel franchise.
Yeah, it's been a fascinating journey for sure. Exploring the depths of horror and the anxieties that kind of fuel our fascination with the genre.
We've covered a lot of ground here, from the film's visual style and thematic depth to their cultural impact and, their enduring legacy.
And we've done it all with you, our listener, in mind, providing insights and analysis that go beyond just the surface level.
So as you continue your own exploration of the horror genre, just remember to keep an open mind, a critical eye, and a healthy sense of curiosity.
Because sometimes the most frightening monsters are the ones that we find within ourselves.
And that is a thought to keep you up at night.
Hmm.
Until next time, keep exploring those dark corners of cinema. And remember, the best horror films don't just scare us, they make us think.